We certainly don't have conclusions, but we have some theses, and we have some hints of things that may become conclusions. And let me frame what I would say the biggest one is at this stage, which is that there is a tension that all governments have when they're fighting a crisis between two things. One is the very real desire to punish people who may have taken on a lot of risk, perhaps imprudently, or who have made mistakes, or who you just think, look, they were going to get the upside, so they should get the downside too. Part of this is what Tim Geithner calls Old Testament justice, just the feeling of, what is right. But part of it is the honest belief that some people have that if you want to avoid having financial crises in the future, you need to make sure that people who know that they are in trouble or have taken too much risk are going to feel the consequences of their actions, and thus might take on a little less risk when they're making those decisions in the future. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is that in a crisis moment itself, it's often very hard to separate out who really is in trouble and who is just being carried along with the crowd. When you get runs on banks, it's simpler for people to just take their money out of all of the banks than to spend weeks and months trying to figure out which bank is actually healthy and not. So therefore, institutions that participate in the markets are always looking for ways to demonstrate that they themselves are healthy in a crisis. And so whenever a government puts into place a program that might help some institutions, strong institutions immediately want to say we don't need it, which stigmatizes the help and makes any institution that goes for that help be treated in the market as though they were about to fail. And it tends to then fold back on itself as accelerating the panic. So it's really quite difficult. If you know that many, many institutions are really solvent, but are in desperate need of liquidity, and you make liquidity available to those institutions, then simply by making use of that liquidity, those institutions might be telling the market that they're much worse off than they are. So they're reluctant to even use the rescues and be punished for the rescues that they kind of need, but not through any fault of their own. And in a crisis, we have the debate all the time, ultimately, that comes down often to people's core beliefs about how important Old Testament justice is versus how important it is to rescue the system. What we've discovered, I would say, through just looking at the examples we've looked at so far, is that meting out Old Testament justice in a surprising way, in a way that people weren't expecting in the midst of a crisis, tends to make things worse, without the consummate benefit that you think you might be getting. So some countries were much tougher on their bankers than others. So the United Kingdom was fairly tough on their senior management of banks and more aggressive in going after people for criminal penalties. But the United Kingdom had pretty much just the same tough reaction against the government's actions as we had here in the United States, where the evidence is that we weren't as tough. We didn't mete out as much Old Testament justice. So one would think that's a benefit, but you don't end up really getting it. Certainly when you are fighting a crisis, you want to have, you are in a different kind of situation than if you're just facing a failure of a single institution. So we've put into place automatic processes in a lot of countries that will take place if a large financial institution fails. Many of these processes were not in place prior to the global financial crisis. I think, and many of the people that we interviewed for the Group of 30 project think, that these processes will work really well if it's one large institution that's gotten in trouble for idiosyncratic reasons. So you have a large institution, they made some mistakes, they had some fraud, they made a bad bet, and they're failing. These are really good processes to have. I would say there's skepticism about whether those in place a priori processes that have been set up will work if 5 or 6 large institutions need to go through them at once. So there's a sense in which, in a systemic crisis, meaning you are concerned that a big chunk of your financial system might be insolvent. And because of that concern, people are running from it. In a systemic crisis, a lot of the regular things that we've put in place to handle idiosyncratic failure might turn out to be counterproductive.